Hello everyone, and welcome to Autocrat. Today's episode is a bonus, and we will be talking about the experience of studying the Roman Empire academically, or at least Roman history. And we are delighted to be joined today by Elliot, who is a student of Roman history.
It's a pleasure to be on. Thank you for having me.
No problem. Thank you for being here. So, we are still very much in the mythology stages of the podcast at the minute, so we would be thrilled to get a bit more insight into the experience of studying a period a bit later on. So, first of all, have you got any general insights for us before we begin?
Well, it's quite an interesting period to study because it's obviously the most well known. That transition from republic to principate.
Yeah,
it comes with a lot of distinct challenges. I think interpreting the original sources is always something quite difficult because obviously you never know what agenda they were writing for, whether or not they were just making things up or not.
Yeah.
So just an example of that. Aside from Rome, I also do Greece and Persia. And reading Herodotus, it's like a bit of a struggle trying to find what's worth crediting and what's not. The same goes for Plutarch, Sallust, etc.
What I find interesting is that it appears the ancient sources have very different priorities in what they find unusual. I was once reading the Historia Augusta, which I'm sure you have mountains of stuff to say about that, but during the reign of Antoninus Pius, in a list of events, they just randomly mentioned that some quintuplets were born. It's just funny seeing the priorities of the ancient world, as if that's noteworthy enough to include in a historical text.
Well, obviously, it's like the famous story of Marius and the 7 eagles.
Yeah.
How true is that, really?
Yeah.
I don't think that appears in any writing until 30 odd years after the death of Marius.
Yeah. Now, you might have to enlighten us there. So, what is this story, and roughly when would it be placed? Because I know a bit about Marius, but not that much.
So, Gaius Marius, incredibly famous for his Marian reforms in the army, and sort of setting the pathway for men like Caesar and popularis politicians like that. He was a novice homo as well, so his father was a tanner, I believe. So Marius, so this tale goes, was when he was a boy, he stumbled across 7 eagles, which he viewed as a sign from Jupiter that he was to be consul of the Republic 7 times.
Right.
And so in the run-up to his 6th consulship, he starts to say, view this as a prophecy. Sorry, in the run-up to his 7th consulship. And then I suppose it's backed up further with after he reaches his 7th consulship, he dies just days later. So
yeah, I suppose it's good luck for him. There happened to be 7.
Yes.
So maybe you could give us a bit of an introduction as to what we're talking about, because obviously Marius, or Marius, I believe you've been calling him. Is that the correct pronunciation?
I think it was actual Latin. I've done some Latin, but not too much. I think it'd just be Marius, but
right.
Marius. I'd like to say Marius, but I just say Marius sometimes out of reflex.
Yeah. Well, we'll go with shocking inconsistency throughout then. Well, anyway, Marius is during the end of the Roman Republic. So how do we get to a Roman Republic in the first place?
Well, that period in the late Republic, how do we get to there? It's I think it all culminates with the fall of Carthage,
right?
With that influx of slaves, economic prosperity into Rome. So previously, before 146 and the fall of Carthage, the patricians and the ruling class, they're rich, they're wealthy, and they're powerful. But after this, the wealth becomes insurmountable.
Right.
Like it's a humongous amount of money, and I think to go along with that, the loss of any great threat to Rome itself. So that leads to great decadence and leads to generals being able to just look at seizing power for themselves, because now it's, if you rule Rome, you rule the known world.
Yeah.
So I think there's that, because if you look from the fall of Carthage as well, after that Rome doesn't really face any great threat aside from Parthia. Parthia isn't really a great threat. It's often just Germanic tribes and Gauls, which yes, they do pose their own like minor threats, but there's not anything existential like Carthage, is it?
Yeah. So, from Rome's creation in about the 8th century BCE through the kingdom and then the early republic, and then on to the mid-republic even, Carthage is, later on at least, the big threat they're pushing against once, say, Italy has been unified. And so after we get Carthage falling, there's this wealth divide opening up. And Rome sort of loses agency, I think is fair to say, in a sense, or at least direction.
Yeah, I'd say that's completely fair to say. Equally as well, these generals that Rome have prior to the fall of Carthage, they're focused on defending Rome and so on. After that, you get your Pompeys and your Caesars and your Sullas, and at the end of the day, nearly all of their wars aren't for wars in the interest of Rome. They're in the interest of Caesar, Pompey, Sulla, for example. So Caesar, the Gallic Wars, despite the fact that he does conquer Gaul, at the end of the day, it's a PR campaign for Caesar. And I think from the fall of Carthage onwards, politics is far more personal. I think there's no more the idea of like the true res publica, like it's dead. I think by the fall of Carthage, yeah.
Now, I think it's fair to say that the Gracchi brothers, who we'll introduce a bit in a moment, are quite important in this story of the transition from the mid to the late Republic and this era of personal politics and the polarization of Roman politics.
Oh, 100%, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, the thing is about Tiberius Gracchus is he really exemplifies the point I'd like to make about Carthage and the fall of Carthage. He's right around that time. He's famously he wins the civic crown for being the first man over the walls of Carthage, right. In the sack of Carthage. He was the son of Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus the Elder. He was a former consul, censor, I do believe, as well. His uncle-in-law, I believe, is Scipio Africanus, and he's got Scipio Aemilianus related to him. So he's got all these humongous connections, and Tiberius Gracchus really overhauls the whole system. You know, despite the fact that he is part of the ruling elite, he's I hesitate to use the phrase "man of the people" because politics in Rome is always so selfish. But he is, in a sense, a man of the people in the fact that in his agrarian land reforms, he really seems to be pushing for the peasants against the wealth of the Senate. And you got to bear in mind the Senate and the senators are getting richer and richer after the fall of Carthage, which is right around this time. So I think Tiberius is the first person to really challenge that status quo that's been around since 509 BC.
I do believe he passed a law moving land from the rich to the poor in around 133 BCE, and it did pass.
Yeah, that was so. His agrarian reforms to get the ager publicus redistributed. So the ager publicus was in public land, was land owned by nobody, not owned by the state. And the idea, well, in the early republic is, famously the idea of the ideal Roman man was a farmer who worked in the fields. The idea was that the peasants would pop up their own mini farms there, but increasingly after the fall of Carthage, all this land was being eaten up by the rich and ever growing richer senators, and the peasants and people being kicked off.
Yeah.
Obviously, you've got to bear in mind at this time as well, the army isn't professional yet. So sometimes you're having soldiers going off to war, coming back 5 years later from campaign, and they're not paid and they've lost their farm, and that's a real issue. I think there's another really important issue as well, which was after the king of Pergamon dies, he wills his estates to the Roman people in order to avoid a war. And the way Tiberius views this is that it should directly be settled by the Roman people. It's not the right of the Senate to decide what's done. However, the Senate they completely go against this. The Senate are trying to send proconsuls there, turning it full on province, and that's a real set of contention during Tiberius' tribunate.
Right. Okay, now this is King Attalus III of Pergamon, I believe,
yes,
who gets the land inherited.
Yes.
To Rome, rather.
So, was this inheritance of the King Attalus unexpected then?
It didn't come expected, no. It was a surprise to the Romans, I do believe, because the Senate weren't planning on this happening. But, I mean, upon this happening, the Senate were more than happy to, send, senators out there and to create into its own province, whereas Tiberius, in his sort of, I don't want to say war with the Senate, well, yeah, it's somewhat of a proxy war with the Senate, is going against everything they're doing at this time, so
right.
He believes it falls under his agrarian council.
We can see he kind of profits of this a bit politically then.
Yes, he profits in the sense of the people love Tiberius Gracchus. That can't be overstated just how much they adore him almost. That's completely true, which is why Tiberius thought he should be able to stand for second tribunate. Because even though it's illegal and it's never been done before and it's out of everything that goes with the Republic, Tiberius believed that he had such superior support from all of the plebeians and the lower classes in Rome that he could truly, get anything he wanted passed, and he thought he could be made tribune again, just because of his popularity. But in terms of popularity and importance in the people that matter, they absolutely despised him. In the Senate, they viewed him, with utter disgust as somewhat of a traitor. That goes right from the end of the Numantine War, which wasn't his fault, all the way until, he's beaten to death.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that really didn't end well for him then.
No, and I think, if I'm correct, that's the first incident of one of the first serious incidents of political-based violence in Rome. And it's even more important than that it violates the sacrosanctity of the tribunate.
Right.
Previously, the nature of the office is that it's sacrosanct. The killing of Tiberius is incredibly shocking because the idea of killing a tribune is unfathomable to the Romans, which is why they actually have to say that the killing of Tiberius was a religious act, because if they say it wasn't a religious act, it's the killing of a tribune, and it's one of the worst crimes you can commit. That's why it's headed by Tiberius' cousin, who was also Pontifex Maximus. So there was some air of legitimacy to his murder, but it's on shaky ground.
Right. I get the impression that it's not planned out in the sense that Tiberius's cousin, who I believe is called Scipio, just grabs a weapon and tells whoever wants to protect the Republic to follow him.
Yeah.
And then from there we get this bloodletting. But I suppose there is an interesting parallel here. I believe the podcaster and historian Mike Duncan, who is behind the History of Rome podcast, drew a parallel between the decline of the Roman Republic and the United States of America. And I suppose the question I would ask is, in the US, we have seen this same level of polarization, maybe not quite to the same extent, but would you say there are parallels between that ancient story and our modern day, at least to some extent?
I really think with Tiberius Gracchus, yes. I think all the way until the end of the late Republic, I think someone who really emphasises modern day America is Claudius Pulcher, who really gives off a Donald Trump kind of vibe to me. But I can see the divisiveness in the streets is visible in America, obviously with Capitol riots and the BLM protests and so on. There is division there, but I wouldn't say it's necessarily comparable to the late Roman Republic in the sense of it's hard to compare anything that's ancient and modern just because of how different everything is. I think in the Roman Republic, the reason people are rioting and the streets are filled with blood is for completely different reasons than in America today. I'd like to think that America's a little bit more stable because I don't see a threat of civil war there. Yeah. But I think in terms of political figures and so on, there are a lot of parallels because this is a sort of rise of demagoguery and populist politics, isn't it? The populares, obviously. So it's I think Tiberius, Gaius, Gracchus, Claudius, Caesar could all be lumped in with an almost Donald Trump-esque like demagogic figure. What do you think about that?
I think it's certainly interesting that there are historians who have made parallels between that, and certainly upon researching the Gracchi a bit for the purposes of this episode, I've noticed this idea of polarization and an increased divide, which arguably you could see in some modern countries today, perhaps not for the same extent or for the same reasons, but it's certainly interesting that others have drawn parallels to this.
Yeah.
So, on the subject of demagoguery then, I'm very interested in asking you more about Pulcher, but for now, we should address the fact that Tiberius Gracchus did have a brother, Gaius Gracchus, who...
Yes, he did.
Who I've seen described as better at speaking and more volatile and more openly against convention than even his brother had been. And his story similarly doesn't end well after he in fact does get the second tribunate his brother was aiming for, and even tries for a third.
Yeah, it's the third that got him in the end.
Yeah.
Well, I find Gaius really interesting because he's so different to Tiberius in the sense of if you look before Gaius' tribunate, he's unwilling. He's not particularly interested in going into politics. He's forced to an extent, and that even continues to his second tribunate. Gaius doesn't stand for re-election as second tribunate. He's selected as for a second tribunate. He doesn't go for it like Tiberius does. So even though I'd say Gaius's reforms and everything he tries to pass through are probably far more important than Tiberius is. I think Gaius was doing what he was doing out of almost a necessity, whereas Tiberius was choosing to. Tiberius had every chance to retire, whereas the Senate was provoking Gaius, and he had to turn his back on them eventually.
Right. Well, now that we've covered the Gracchi bit, I suppose I'm now curious to ask you more about Pulcher, because this is not a name I've particularly come across, at least, and in the podcast narrative we won't for a good number of episodes yet. So would you be able to tell us a bit more about him?
Well, famously, Clodius comes to attention in the Bonadea scandal. The Bonadea scandal, in my opinion, is quite possibly the most ridiculous, crazy event that happens in the late Republic that really shows how far the Republic's fallen in terms of, well, like virtue and so on. I don't understand Clodius. So he goes to religious rites at the house of Caesar, dressed as a woman, and risks his whole political career on that.
Right.
And Clodius comes to the fray here, and famously he earns the enmity of Cicero. So in the trial of Clodius, Cicero gives evidence against him, which later in 58 leads to Cicero's exilement itself.
Right. Well, it certainly sounds like the late Roman Republic is full of very turbulent and very interesting stories in the transition to empire.
Oh, it's really interesting to me because it's like seeing the old Republic, which works like clockwork, sort of slowly fall into a sham. So Clodius he's not a pleb, he's a patrician. He's a member of the Claudii, the most ancient and famous patrician gens. Yet somehow he's able to be adopted by an adult plebeian who is younger than him and become tribune of the plebs.
Right.
But I think that sort of really puts emphasis on just how much of a sham the late Roman Republic was.
Yeah. This idea again of constitutional norms just being broken openly.
Well, the issue with the Roman Republic for me, is that so many of the conventions and rules were just conventions. They weren't laws. So for Tiberius, for example, he doesn't take his bills to the Senate and he passes them straight to the assemblies. It's not law that the Senate has to hear these things. It's just expected that they will, and that causes loads of division. Later on, with so many politicians sort of post the Gracchi making use of constitutional loopholes.
Now, I think it's fair to say that the Republican Senate was pretty much built around the idea of one man not gaining too much power after Rome expelled their kings in 509 BC. So, do you have any more insight into how exactly the Senate had tried to stop too much power building up in the hands of one man, and maybe why that went wrong?
Well, I think what's interesting to me, at least, about the late Republic is how the Senate truly sort of fails at every turn. The Senate never seems to understand how to stop one-man rule and how to stop the man like Caesar that they so feared from taking so much power. Because the issue with many of the Optimates politicians, your Cato, Cicero, and so on, is that rather than focusing on the good of the Republic and the good of the Constitution, they're more focused on just going against anything that their political rivals pass. So even if Caesar has a bill that is helpful to the Republic, if Pompey has a bill that is useful for the Republic, Cato will filibuster it. They'll have tribunes veto it just for the sake of it. So even the politicians who were so-called upholding the Republican values weren't truly upholding anything. They were simply there to be difficult or to veto just their enemies for any point they'll make, bad or good.
So at this point, I would like to ask what exactly a veto is and what it stands for. I believe it means in Latin, I forbid. So is it just a way of stopping laws in their tracks, pretty much?
A veto cannot be overruled.
Right.
That's the really key essence of what the veto is. If one of the 10 tribunes vetoes your law, that's it. The business is done for the day. You're done. Because that's the whole nature of the power of the tribunate. It's why Sulla, in his dictatorship, goes to great lengths to reduce the power of the tribunate, because he knows that powerful tribunes can cause really, really serious damage to the Republic and to high up politicians' political careers. So, for example, Clodius was a tribune of the plebs. Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus were tribunes of the plebs. And Sulpicius Rufus was Gaius Marius started off as tribune of the plebs, so on. All these really influential and really groundbreaking figures all achieved so much during their tribunates that the power of the veto really can't be oversold, because that was the tribunate's key and most crucial power.
It is interesting how long some of these republican institutions stay around, even if the republic itself doesn't last. So, for example, in Suetonius's 12 Caesars, the 2 consuls present ruling in each year are mentioned, for example, when emperors are born. Now, by the time of, say, Domitian, we're quite firmly in the imperial period, but the idea of 2 consuls stays around, and I believe it lasts until Emperor Leo VI, ruling at the end of the 9th century and start of the 10th. So it's remarkable how long that stays in business, in a sense at least.
Yeah, I find that really interesting. I think one of the really interesting things about ancient Rome as a topic is how they really hold on to their traditions. So despite the fact that the Republic clearly isn't the Republic, by the time we're at Diocletian, we're in the dominant. The Senate is no more than a city council of Rome at this point. Yet it holds on to the official state name being the Res Publica. I believe there is a certain Leo I Solidus around that hails him as saviour of the Republic, and that's that's in the Byzantine era even. The Romans never believed they'd left the Republic, and in an extent, under Augustus they hadn't, essentially. The system of voting wasn't abandoned until Tiberius, so they still went and voted for their political candidates, but you just voted for whoever Augustus said so because you loved Augustus so much. The Republic never really died because Augustus kept it on life support as a sham. And even after Diocletian, in the Dominate onwards, the Romans hold on to their traditions and their past because that's who they are. That's why Theodosius had to issue a law saying that all senators must wear their togas, despite the fact that nobody wore togas anymore. It's because the Romans are so sort of firm on holding their traditions.
It reminds me a little bit, in terms of historical parallels, of Napoleon Bonaparte almost claiming to be the embodiment of the French Revolution when, in 1804, he declares himself Emperor of the French, which fairly obviously goes against the principles of a republic. Which is interesting.
Yeah, I can see that. Augustus is very unique in a sense of he isn't emperor. He is merely the first citizen. The emperor isn't this figure that we have the idea of today of a powerful man who you prostrate in front of, who you weep in front of and don't look in the eye. The emperor was merely the lead senator. That's how Augustus was viewed, as pater patriae, father of the nation. You can see how these things change. So, for example, on coinage, in the early empire, it's seriously Imperator, Kaiser, Augustus, pater patriae, father of the nation. And by the time you've gotten to, I think it's Constantine onwards even, the coin's no longer pater patriae, it's Dominus Nostrae, which is our Lord. So you're going from that almost, I don't want to say warm fatherly figure of father of the nation. So it slowly evolves into Dominus Nostrae, our Lord, which really sort of shows how the petitions have changed from that of merely the first senator to, well, medieval king, essentially.
Yeah. Well, the mention of Constantine, I suppose, leads us quite nicely to the final main point that we can address today, which is what's coming up next for you. I believe you mentioned that you are planning to study the fall of the Roman Empire, or at least the western half, at university.
Yes, that's what I'm off to do. The fall of the West, to me, is like truly the most interesting period in Roman history, because I really do enjoy the Republic and the early Empire. But to me, the fall of the West is what we can draw parallels the most to our modern day. It's just so much is happening. The Roman army has gotten to a point where it's no longer Roman. It's foederati, nearly the whole thing. Civil war is tearing bits and pieces apart. Yet you still have strong emperors like Constantine and Theodosius, and even very, very late into the 450s, Majorian, Anthemius even, being complete heroes. So Majorian, even in the 450s, reunites most of the Western Empire, and even attempts to cross into Vandalic Africa and take back Roman lands there, and was very nearly successful if he wasn't betrayed. So I think when we look at the late Roman Empire, we can really see a massive contrast of figures. You can see really heroic figures such as Majorian, and really incompetent figures such as Honorius, or not for the West, but Arcadius for the East. It's just there's no time period in history which has such a wide variety of things going on.
Overall, if I can ask a question, would you believe, or do you think, would get the medal for best Roman emperor and the medal for worst Roman emperor?
Oh, is that including Byzantine emperors?
Yeah.
We thought we'd make the challenge harder for you.
There can be more than one at the first place and more than one at the last place, if that makes it easier.
I see. I think, but last place would have to be Honorius for me.
Yeah.
Like, the incompetence from Honorius is, I mean, it's pathetic. I mean, everyone's heard the story of one of his attendants runs in and goes, my lord, Rome has fallen, and Honorius is in bits. He's devastated, and then once he finds out it's the city of Rome and not his pet chicken Rome, he's fine. I think that it really emphasises who Honorius was.
Yeah.
I think my best emperor. I've really started to get into my Eastern Roman history a bit more because I was less versed in that. I really do like Basil II.
Yeah.
But I think it might be basic, but I really think it was Augustus. I think you're safe with Augustus because I think without Augustus, you don't have that springboard for an empire that will go on to last all the way into 1453. Without Augustus, I think, Rome whimpers up and dies in the 1st century AD from civil wars or from an invasion from Parthia or so on, because Augustus really sets up Rome for all those centuries of prosperity. I mean, there's a reason every single emperor, all the way until Constantine XI, even though it was less used at the time, still had the title of Augustus. In correspondences in the West, he refers to himself in letters as ever Augustus. I think the legacy of Augustus is too hard to ignore, so I think I'll have him as my number one.
Yeah.
And Honorius is my complete bottom, below bottom, like buried in a coffin somewhere.
Yeah. Well, both solid choices. I mean, personally, when it comes to best, I've been quite drawn recently on the subject of Eastern Roman history to Alexios I.
Ooh. I've never heard that before.
Oh, really?
I've never heard someone have Alexios I as their number one.
No, he's quite a fanboy of Alexios.
We were hosting a recording recently for an upcoming project, and that's all I'll say on that, listeners. But I had to mention Alexios I, and my co-host told me that my eyes visibly lit up when I started talking.
I think if you ask me about Cicero, that is the same with me. I adore him. He's my favourite.
Yeah.
I mean, my favourite usually raised on my eyebrows because my favourite for really fun reason is Caligula.
Caligula?
Just because he's so crazy, I like him.
One of my favourite figures is Sextus Pompeius, the son of Pompey, because he's just such a funny figure. In this whole sort of scene after the death of Caesar, Antony and Octavian are really fighting for power, and then just there in the background for completely no reason, Pompey's son's just attacking them with boats, just for no reason.
Yeah. Sextus is quite an undiscovered figure, and that in a way is the joy of Roman history. It's so vast that there's always new stories to just be uncovered, like, for instance, Antoninus Pius being listed in the Historia Augusta as dying from eating too much cheese.
Yeah. Well, I think the thing that draws so many people to Rome is just how accessible it is, in the sense that we have so much that survived. We have whole letters, we have whole books, we have so many monuments. Even though it's so far away, it feels so close in a sense.
Yeah. I've experienced that with, for example, Cicero's works, where I am not looking forward to having to digest all of it. Not because it's not quality writing, but just how much there will be.
Yeah, it's hard to keep track of with Cicero as well, because what you find with Cicero is that a lot of his letters it contain inside jokes, because and you're trying to read it, and it brings me, it stumps me a bit. I think he refers to Caesar as Baldy a lot, and you've got to get used to that whenever he refers to Caesar.
Isn't that to do with the name Caesar having something to do with hair?
It might be, but I think it's also due to the fact that Caesar was famously, like incredibly shy about his baldness.
Oh, okay.
That's why he was known to wear his laurel crown everywhere.
Oh, that's brilliant.
Didn't like people looking at his bald spots.
Well, I mean, I think Caesar's bald spots is as good a point as any to leave the episode on. So, well, Elliot, thank you very much for joining us on the show today, and we wish you all the best with your future studies.
Thank you for having me on. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Have a great week, everyone.